Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Surya Moon, co-director of the Global Health Center at the Graduate Institute of Geneva. As we usually do, I'll give everybody just about a minute to get logged in, get comfortable, and get settled before we dive into our webinar today, which some of you may or may not know is actually our last webinar, not only of 2021, but for a little while. So a little bit more on that in just a moment. Give people a chance to join. Okay, great. As I said, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm really delighted to be welcoming all of you to our webinar today, where we will be focusing on biosecurity research and development, lessons from the US from before and post. One day, hopefully, we will be post-COVID. We have, I'm really delighted, we have two fantastic, highly expert speakers today. Dr. Joe Larson and Professor Daniel Gross. I'll be introducing both of them to you in a bit more detail in a second. But first, let me just give you some background on the webinar itself and how we'll be spending our next hour together. Just as a reminder, this webinar series is part of the Knowledge Network on Innovation and Access to Medicines. What we want to do is to maximize how research and analysis can contribute to globally equitable innovation and access to medicines, and also facilitate two-way flows of knowledge between the research and the policy practice communities. We've developed a website where you can access on an open access basis all sorts of information, including summaries of the academic literature on a wide range of policy topics under the sub themes of pricing, intellectual property, and innovation. And we've also been running these webinars for over 3 years now, and we make recordings of these webinars available at that website. So please do note that this webinar is being recorded, and you should have been informed of that when you clicked to log on and to join. I'm both proud and sad to announce that this is the last webinar of the series, and I really want to thank my co-host Marcela Vieira, who is here behind the scenes, who has really been the driving force behind this webinar series. We've done 26 of these since October of 2018 with 38 speakers from 18 different countries. We hope to build on that in the future. We've had over 2,500 attendees from almost 100 countries. And what we'd like to do in January for anybody who has ever registered for any of our webinars, you will be receiving from us a request to fill out a survey as we take a pause and we reassess and rethink where we'd like to take this webinar series in the brave new world that we're in. But indeed, you can see all of the recordings of these 26 webinars on the Knowledge portal. As I mentioned, this is indeed being recorded. We'd like to warmly welcome questions from participants, and we try to reserve about half of our time for that. Please do type into the chat. Make sure you select to everyone. You can also raise your hand if you'd like to just speak directly to and pose your question directly to our guests. Afterwards, there will be 4 questions that we ask you to respond to through an anonymous survey. And if you have any feedback or suggestions for future topics, please feel free to send them to the email that you see on the screen, globalhealthresearch@graduateinstitute.ch. So just a few words of introduction in terms of today's topic. As I said, we could not imagine a more timely and important topic than how health technologies for outbreaks of infectious disease get developed, and ultimately, of course, who gets access to them. COVID-19 has certainly heightened interest in many, many countries on how to ensure both innovation and access as a way of ensuring both preparedness and the ability to respond to pandemics. And I need not remind most people of the current situation of vaccine inequity that the world continues to find itself in a year after the first vaccines were approved. I think one of the similarities that we'll be delving into a bit further in one of the presentations is between COVID-19 and the Second World War, both in terms of the scale of the crisis that we're looking at, but also the importance of technological innovation in shaping the way societies have been able to respond and try to meet the challenges of these crises. One of the reasons that we are focusing today on the US is because in our background research on biosecurity R&D, it became quite clear that the greatest amount of literature, at least in the English language, and arguably the largest scale and most well-established innovation system for what I will call countermeasure R&D, or what we also refer to as biosecurity R&D, is indeed in the US. Many other countries have developed interest, as I said. A few other countries seem to also have well-established sizable national innovation systems focusing on emerging infectious diseases and potential pandemics, but none of them, at least in our background research, really are at the scale of the US system. So there do seem to be many lessons to be learned and insights to be drawn, both positive as well as areas for improvement from the US experience. And I could not imagine better speakers to join us today than the two that we have managed to rope into this exercise. So let me introduce them to you. First, we'll be hearing from Dr. Joseph Larson, who, as you can see, is Vice President at Venatorx Pharmaceuticals, also former Deputy Director at BARDA for the division of, I'm going to get this wrong, CBRN, I think Joe will have to correct me, countermeasures, biological, radiological, nuclear threats. But he'll tell us what CBRN.
Chemical, biological, radiological,
thank you.
And nuclear. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I always get that wrong. So he has 20 years of experience as a well-known global expert on this subject. He'll be speaking today in his personal capacity, representing neither Venatorx Pharmaceuticals nor the US government, nor BARDA in particular, but certainly his wide experience across different sectors will be very valuable as he shares his insights. He also has extensive experience in the antibiotics field and helped to create and launch CARB-X, which is a unique public-private partnership trying to advance the development of novel antibiotics, and has a PhD in microbiology, and so it comes at this problem, I think, from a scientific as well as from a practitioner's perspective. After Joe speaks, we'll be hearing from Professor Daniel Gross, who's currently at Duke University's Fuqua School of Business. Dan is an economist who focuses at the nexus of strategy, economics, and public policy, focusing on innovation policy. He delves deeply into history to extract insights that are relevant for public policy today, and recently has been developing a growing body of work on crisis innovation in particular, including implications for post-crisis. And I think we do all hope we will soon be in a post-crisis phase. Prior to joining Duke, he was at Harvard's Business School. So each of them will speak for 15 minutes. Please feel free to pose your questions in the chat, as I said, or raise your hand. And in the second half of the hour, we'll try to reserve at least 20-25 minutes for moderated Q&A. So without further ado, Joe, let me give the floor over to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks a lot. And thanks everybody for joining. I'm going to stop your sharing, it says. Can we see this?
Yes, looks great. Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, the paper that I know was included in the materials or was basically a 10-year progress review of Project BioShield. And in the discussion today, we're going to talk about some elements that were needed to be in place to bring about the robust pipeline of medical countermeasures for bioterrorism agents that's present within the US. And we'll discuss some areas in the future where I think some things could be improved or bolstered, but it's really a focus on the products that have been stockpiled between 2006 and 2016 and the policies that basically enabled those countermeasures to come to fruition. So again, just to reiterate my disclaimer, the opinions expressed here are my own. They're not Venatorix's, BARDA's, or the US government's. So for historical context, as many of you probably are aware, following the attacks of September 11th, there was the Amerithrax attacks, where an individual sent letters contaminated with anthrax to various media as well as government facilities here in the United States. And following those attacks, there was a keen interest in bolstering the supply of medical countermeasures. At that time, there was very little interest on the part of pharmaceutical and biotech companies to produce these type of products, because frankly, there was no market. And so if there's no market, you can't attract investors. If you can't attract investors, you're not doing much of anything. And so there was a need or a interest in developing a program that would basically supply that marketplace, which in the end became Project Bioshield. Project Bioshield was established in law in 2004, July 21st. It was signed by President George W. Bush. And this created a $5.6 billion fund for the procurement of medical countermeasures. So procurement meaning direct purchasing and stockpiling. Another interesting thing about this, typically money that is appropriated from Congress is what's called an annual appropriation, meaning that that's the amount of money for 1 year, and then next year it could be a different amount of money, and the next year it could be zero. This actually was funded with what's called no-year money, which means there was no time for which the money would expire. It basically served as a significant bank account to purchase and bolster the United States' capacity to be able to respond to a bioterrorism event. And as you can imagine, countermeasures for anthrax specifically were a high priority, particularly in terms of stockpiling antibiotics, stockpiling, in particular, the anthrax vaccine. Before we go any further, though, it's important to understand the different types of incentives that can exist to incentivize research and development. And these are push incentives and pull incentives. So push incentives subsidize the development costs. So you basically are funding research, de-risking programs for the future purchase or procurement. Pull incentives basically only reward successful research and basically exist as almost an advanced market commitment, so that if I successfully deliver X, you're going to pay me Y. And to underscore the points that I'll make in subsequent slides, it is really this combination, if I were to give any singular piece of advice about what made Project Bioshield and BARDA successful, it is the combination of push incentives to support research and development to lower technical risk, and then having pull incentives in the form of Project Bioshield to ensure procurement and sustained procurement of those products going forward into the future. And it's that combination that has allowed BARDA to achieve over 50 FDA approvals, to stockpile multiple different products for a number of different threats that we'll talk about today. But it wasn't always that way. So in the first iteration of Bioshield that passed in 2004, that $5.6 billion could only be used to purchase products. They could not support research and development. And so even at the time, 5.6 billion seems like a lot of money, but it really didn't attract large pharmaceutical companies with a depth of expertise. It tended to attract smaller biotech companies that had maybe one or two different technologies in their portfolio. And what ended up happening in this specific instance, the headline here, the HHS cancels Vaxgen vaccine contract, and this was an $877 million contract for the procurement of a recombinant protective antigen anthrax vaccine. And what happened was that there was a challenge, a technical challenge in being able to create a stable formulation of this vaccine. But the company could only get paid when it delivered the doses of vaccine. And it struggled to do so. BARDA had, or it wasn't even BARDA at that time, the precursor organization to BARDA that ran Project BioShield only had the ability to procure products. It did not have the ability to support R&D. And so the contract, they never were able to deliver product. The contract failed. They were basically terminated for default. And it ended up all over the front page of many, many newspapers here in the United States. So recognizing that setback, well, I should say, so this is an example here of where you have just the pull incentive and no push incentive. You have no ability to support R&D to de-risk the technologies for procurement. And this was a significant setback in the early stages of BARDA. A later setback was one in which that basically was during my tenure there, is that we also saw that if we just gave push incentives, that also was insufficient to ensure that the technologies that we were supporting were sustainable and available into the future. And there's no bigger case of this to me than in antibiotic development. As many of you may be aware, there are significant commercial challenges in commercializing an antibiotic, and there's a myriad of reasons for that, probably that we don't have time to get into today, but it's basically that they are basically profits are directly proportional to volume, and that these are products we want to hold in reserve to embrace the principles of antibiotic stewardship, and that creates a very challenging business model. And some would even go as far to say that the antibiotic market is broken. But in these two cases here, BARDA supported two different antibiotics. One was a drug called plazomicin that a company called Achaogen developed, and another was called Vabomere that eventually ended up in a company called Melinta. And in the case of Achaogen, we gave them probably in excess of $200 million to develop plazomicin for the treatment of carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae. And at their time of FDA approval in July of 2018, they had a market capitalization of $1 billion. And within 12 months, they had gone bankrupt. And so BARDA has since taken a turn in this and has begun awarding Project BioShield contracts to antibiotic developers that have bioterrorism applications. And they've recently announced a 4 by 2030 initiative where they plan on procuring 4 new antibiotics for the Strategic National Stockpile by 2030. So it seems that they're learning the lessons of the past, and that embracing this concept of both push and pull being required, which is absolutely critical. So this did change, and their ability to support research and development changed with the passage of another law in the United States called the Pandemic All Hazardous Preparedness Act, or PAPA is what it's called for short. So this, one thing it did is it created BARDA, it created the Biomedical Advanced Research Development Authority. It authorized their ability to support advanced research and development of new medical countermeasures. One negative thing it did is that it lowered the value of Project BioShield from $5.4 billion to $2.8 billion, and then switched it from what no year money appropriation, meaning that bank account just in perpetuity was gone, and switched it to an annual appropriation. So one year we may get, or BARDA would maybe receive $500 million for Project BioShield, and the next year it would receive $225 million, and the next year it would receive $350 million. And that also represented a significant challenge, which I would highlight too to anyone thinking about creating an organization that does this sort of work, is that you really need sustained funding and sufficient and sustained funding, because those kinds of vacillations in the funding level made it extremely challenging for us to plan these procurements, and also made it challenging to be a trusted partner with many of our industry partners, because they were counting, and their investors were counting on these procurements to ensure their corporate viability. And if we couldn't be a trusted partner in those discussions because of factors out of our control, then that was putting us in a relatively weaker position. But this law was also reauthorized in June of 2020, and so it is still enabling BARDA to carry out its work to this day. So shifting gears now to just some examples of different products that have been procured by Project BioShield. Initially, you have the Biothrax anthrax vaccine, which is FDA approved. That is a 3-dose vaccine. And so recently, and also in the goal of achieving further sustainability of the strategic national stockpile, they recently moved to supporting the Nuthrax vaccine, which is also made by Emergent Biosolutions. And that's the AVA or anthrax vaccine absorbed combined with a CPG adjuvant. And so that moves us from a 3-dose vaccine to a 2-dose vaccine. And so that you can imagine that it is a massive efficiency in the footprint of the stockpile. And that is currently stockpiled under emergency use authorization. There was 3 different antibody products, 2 monoclonal antibodies and 1 polyclonal antibody that were developed, and all are FDA approved for anthrax. That's Raxibacumab, Anthrasil, and Anthem. And then recently in 2019, BARDA moved forward with the Project BioShield contract to Paratech Pharmaceuticals for Amatacycline or Nuzyra for the treatment of anthrax, and that is currently stockpiled under EUA. So for smallpox, we've also, the US government has made significant progress in developing a suite of countermeasures. Not listed here is the typical smallpox vaccine that's for general use, and we currently have quite a significant volume of that stockpiled here in the United States. But BARDA helped develop and stockpile under Project BioShield Imvamune, which is a modified smallpox vaccine that's meant to be used in basically immunocompromised individuals for which the typical smallpox vaccine would be contraindicated. And that's made by a company called Bavarian Nordic. There also was a goal to develop 2 different smallpox antivirals with distinct mechanisms of action. That came out of an Institute of Medicine's report, basically around discussions related to destroying the remaining variola stocks that are present in Russia and the United States, that 2 different antivirals with distinct mechanisms of action would be required. So Tecovirimat is FDA approved. It's a viral egress inhibitor. It's developed by SIGA Technologies and is also currently stockpiled. And then also Brincidofovir recently got FDA approval. It's a nucleoside analog, DNA replication inhibitor, and it's made by a company called Chimerix. But having both sufficient vaccine for the United States as well as 2 different antivirals is a significant progress against that particular threat. For botulism, it's actually kind of interesting. We actually worked with Emergent Biosolutions, and they basically, there's a horse farm where we have these draft horses, and these horses are very, very large. Like, my head would probably come up to the shoulder of this horse. And they hyperimmunize these horses with botulism toxoid, and then blend the 7 different serotypes together to make a heptavalent botulism antitoxin. And this has also been FDA approved. The CDC uses this regularly in the limited number of botulism outbreaks that occur in the United States. I think about 5 or 6 years ago, there was one associated with nacho cheese sauce that was, this product was deployed and used for people who were exposed to botulism. So for Ebola, we were obviously, okay, I'll pick up the pace. There's a number of different products that have been approved and stockpiled. Basically, a number of the 2 different vaccines, the Merck-based vaccine, which is a VSV-based vaccine, single-dose vaccine, the Janssen Ad-Prime MVA boost vaccine. It's EMA approved, it's got EUA in the United States. And then there's a series of different monoclonal antibody products, as well as diagnostic tests that BARDA has also supported and may procure in the future. In terms of radiation countermeasures, there's 3 different products here: Neulasta, Neupogen, and Leukine, that are focused on the hematopoietic effects of acute radiation exposure. These actually prevent your immune system from getting totally decimated, which are important and have been shown to improve animal survival from radiation exposure in animal models. These are all FDA approved, as well as biodosimetry devices that can basically tell from biomarkers the quantitative level of radiation a person has been exposed to, because in these events, triage of patients, those who you can't save and those who you can save, are absolutely critical. as well as chelating agents to remove the radioisotopes from the body and excrete them. In terms of burn products, we also, or BARDA also procured Silverlawn, which is a silver impregnated bandage, Nexobrid, which is a enzymatic debridement. So it basically chews away the necrotic tissue and allows for a clean wound edge to allow for skin grafting. And it's actually derived from an enzyme in pineapple. RECELL is an autograft sparing technology that basically allows for the donor graft tissue to be about 1/20th of what it normally is. And that the donor grafting part is the most painful part of being burned. And then they also supported a skin substitute. So just in conclusion, that was a quick run there at the end, but BARDA and BioShield have successfully generated medical countermeasures, a whole portfolio to address a number of CBRN threats and concerns. Push and pull incentives are required to make this kind of programs work. The key challenges going forward, I would say, is sustaining all these products that have been developed into the future, as well as broadening the scope of the threats that BARDA focuses on to include more robustly AMR pathogens, which I would contend they are doing. But more critically is that, for when we responded to Ebola, when we responded to Zika, those responses were done with supplemental funding, not BARDA's normal budget. And BARDA currently has no budget line for emerging infectious diseases. They were authorized to work on it, but they never received any appropriations or money to do so. So as we think about COVID and the landscape and how everything has changed, I think it will be absolutely critical to provide sustained funding for emerging infectious diseases for BARDA so that we can actually build a preparedness infrastructure instead of having to respond to these sorts of events. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe, for that really concise but information-packed presentation. I have one quick clarification for you, which is you highlighted a number of products that were procured by BARDA. Out of all of those, what proportion, roughly, did BARDA also support pay for some of the R&D for?
Mostly all.
Most of them. Okay, good.
Mostly
just wanted to clarify that. Thanks so much. There's already a few questions that have come in on the chat. As we listen to the next presentation from Dan Gross, perhaps, Joe, if you want to take any of those questions in the chat, please feel free to do so. But without further ado, let me give the floor over to Professor Gross.
All right, fantastic. Thanks, Suri. And it's great to be here. Really, it's a pleasure to be able to talk to you about this work I've been doing with Bhavin Sampet. I want to make sure that he gets credit for this too. He can't be here today, but he's been a great collaborator in all of the work that I'm going to be talking you through. And I think you'll see that some of the themes we just heard in Joe's talk will carry through and resonate. But why don't we go ahead and dive in? As most of you know, as most of you know, prior to about a year and a half ago, before COVID, crisis innovation policy wasn't a major feature of the US or really global innovation policy dialogue or toolkit. I mean, yes, there was attention to pandemics and infectious disease, but in terms of meeting a moment like the one that COVID presented, or for that matter, like the one that World War II 80 years ago presented, it just wasn't an undercurrent, like a major theme of innovation policy. And of course, that has all changed quite a bit. If anything, perhaps the best precedent we have for the scale of the problem, the scale of the effort that was required in this current and most recent crisis, we think really would be World War II. And let me start to show you why. So many of you probably are in Europe, and so you are intimately familiar with the history that in 1939, 1940, the continent was going up in flames, actually quite literally. Germany invaded Poland, the UK, France declared war on Germany, Russia counterinvades Poland, and you have this whole conflagration taking place in Europe that the US can actually watch from the sidelines, but recognizing how quickly it's spiraling, can see that it's likely to be drawn in. And in mid-1940, a small cabal of scientific administrators in the US goes to the White House, goes to President Roosevelt and says, look, I think we need to start supporting scientific research on military technology. And that leads to the creation of this agency, the OSRD, led by a name some of you may recognize, Vannevar Bush. The core mission of this agency was to support R&D and technologies in medical treatments, to further national defense, but it also took a leading role in coordinating research efforts across the country in support of the war effort, including managing the mobilization of US science. It includes civilian academic scientists, firms, industry, and government researchers too. And this was an unprecedented experiment in crisis innovation policy, and even more so in large-scale funding, public funding of research. I have to emphasize that. There was no template, no precedent for what was about to happen. And before the war, the US government, at least, wasn't involved in any major way in funding research. All of that changed in World War II. Part of what I want to bring into focus is what actually is different about a crisis versus regular times. And this quote from one of the leaders of the OSRD in a retrospective in post-war brings it into focus. The need for speed hangs like a sword over the head. Or this other quote from James Conant, who was another of that small cadre of leaders. The basic problem of mobilizing science during the war was one of setting up rapidly an organization which would connect effectively the laboratory, the pilot plant, the factory, all with each other, and ultimately with the battlefront. In other words, you have this sequence of problems that begin in the lab with basic research, but proceed to production, including production at scale, and ultimately diffusion, and getting the innovation into, in most recent case, shots into arms. Back then, it's getting radar and night vision goggles and several dozen innovations into the hands of soldiers. Now, the OSRD model in World War II had a few features that I would like to bring into focus. It had this applied focus with top-down priority setting. We can dive into this more perhaps in the Q&A if we'd like to. It engaged top R&D performers, so a bit more focus on engaging elite firms and institutions as opposed to spreading contracts across the economy. It was very attentive to contractor incentives and what it would really take to incentivize talented firms with the capabilities it needed into its crisis R&D program. Took, as I mentioned before, took very seriously its role of coordinating research efforts. And then finally, it wasn't just a research funding agency. It invested heavily in production and diffusion and had specific offices designated for those problems too, which I will come back to. Now, this turned out to be an immensely productive effort. It led to developments in technologies as important and now as dual use as radar, high resolution aerial photography. I'm going a bit in a clockwise, counterclockwise circle here. Electrical communication and early computing, pesticides like DDT. Of course, there's nuclear fission, which in atomic energy, which I think we all remember the war for, anti-malarials, and then actually perhaps most relevant to our venue here, mass-produced penicillin. And not only did it yield all this technological innovation, but it also yielded new frameworks for science policy, science and technology policy, which were adopted after the war and became the foundation for the modern US science policy institution. So, the irony in all of that is that what emerged from it in terms of science policy and frameworks weren't really so focused on crisis innovation policy anymore. Rather, we saw the expansion of the federally funded R&D system across a number of agencies, ones you would recognize today. It includes the Department of Defense, the NIH, the Atomic Energy Commission, which is now wrapped into the Department of Energy in the US. And the NSF was originally envisioned by Vannevar Bush to be the crown jewel of this system and really what these other programs were wrapped into. Instead, it turns out to be a puny partner as pieces of the problem get shaved off by different agencies. And if anything, actually, NIH is the crown jewel of the biomedical innovation system in the US today. I want to also point out, I know there's a lot on this slide, let me just jump to the last bullet here. The NIH and its push role in terms of funding life sciences and pharmaceutical research is complemented by the development of the US pharmaceutical industry, which is a partner, a complement in this system, which I should add also has roots in World War II, which is very interesting. If we have time, I'll come back to stories about that, and how Pfizer, for example, completes the arc, closes the circle between the two crises, World War II to COVID-19. So let me go ahead and move on to COVID, our most recent experience. So at the dawn of the pandemic, a number of problems presented themselves. Not only did we need vaccines and therapies for treating COVID itself, we also needed rapid diagnostic tests and testing infrastructure, contact tracing technology, mitigation technologies, including new business models, how to organize schools, education, the workplace for this era of very contagious and ultimately deadly and with health consequences, infectious disease. But we also needed, in addition to that, science for policy, what we might call new evidence to inform decision-making, like how does the virus transmit? Are masks effective, and how far apart do we need to stand? These are all problems that presented themselves. And of course, the losses we were incurring as economies around the world shut down at the early months of the pandemic were immense. Now, in a bit of contrast to the World War II OSRD approach, where you had this one agency managing a broad portfolio, the COVID response, at least in the US, was just especially focused on vaccine development. If we look at what are the most common words weighted by the actual dollars in grants and contracts supported by the US government, this is from BARDA, NIH, NSF, what do we see here? We see vaccine, protein doses, mRNA. It's basically vaccine, vaccine, vaccine. And so this whole suite of problems that I mentioned, they weren't all collectively a focus of attention of the portfolio. Really, there was this heavy emphasis on vaccines. And in part for a reason, vaccines might be the most valuable innovation we can develop, but it certainly wasn't the only one that was needed. And this effort, of course, traces back to Operation Warp Speed, which was perhaps the closest analog that we have to the OSRD in the COVID era. Warp Speed having been organized in the spring of 2020, when early on in the pandemic, actually, Peter Navarro, this is something that I think the White House should get credit for, called for a Manhattan Project for the pandemic. And this ultimately is what developed into Warp Speed. It had a heavy focus on vaccines, though it also funded therapies and focused on the supply chain challenges, logistics of distribution. And as we know, it funded several candidates. It took this portfolio approach to try to balance risk in case any particular approach proved to be ineffective. At least we have several horses in this race. Now, similarities between the two approaches include similarities in the investment strategies, focus on speed over cost, this applied emphasis, as I just mentioned, parallelization with many horses in the race because you don't know which one will actually finish, and developing manufacturing capacity at risk. They also relied on new agencies in implementing policy, whether it's OSRD or BARDA, as we just heard. They both drew heavily on a pre-crisis stock of basic knowledge, whether it's in radar or in penicillin or in mRNA, and in the scientific capabilities that existed in universities and firms. And they actually face some similar trade-offs too. We unpack this more in the work that I think might have been linked to you in the chat. Now, they also had some very clear differences. Warp Speed was explicitly an America First effort, where there was limited collaboration between the US government's effort and so-called allied researchers, whereas in World War II, there actually was quite a bit of collaboration between, for example, US and British research efforts. Moreover, beyond the vaccine development effort, there was limited coordination of COVID-19 research, addressing all the problems that I was pointing us to earlier. There wasn't really an agency that was running air traffic control on the broader set of problems that needed to be addressed. With attempts to identify holes in the portfolio, redundancies in research effort, technical exchange and consolidation of information, outside of vaccines. As a result, perhaps, we saw instead a broad decentralized pivoting to COVID-19 problems by firms and by academics, a lot of decentralized innovation taking place. And a little bit of that, I think, has to be attributed to the nature of the problem, the crisis itself, where World War II had one principal customer, both informing priorities, providing feedback, and also getting engaged in diffusion. That being the military. Whereas in the COVID pandemic, of course, we had anything from hospitals to individual citizens who, of course, were in some sense customers for the innovation that was taking place or needed to take place. So in this work, there are a number of policy trade-offs that we bring into focus. We could spend more time talking about these if we would like to. There are trade-offs in terms of top-down versus bottom-up, so centralized versus decentralized approaches to deciding what are the research priorities. There are trade-offs between concentrating and more, let's say, diversely distributing research funding for the push approaches here. There are trade-offs in patent policy, and especially trading off incentives for innovation versus access and diffusion. And then finally, crises do present disruptions to the innovation system, especially crisis research efforts. As you draw resources, researchers, firms away from existing lines of work and their existing pipelines to more short-run crisis problems. And I think it is useful to ask ourselves, what are the consequences of that for the kinds of problems that the research enterprise is tackling in regular times, and how should we manage that balance? I think this is about where I'll tie us off here. I just want to point out that although this effort in World War II, and it appears so far in COVID-19, the research efforts were relatively successful, their impacts didn't end with the crisis itself. In World War II in particular, the wartime research effort appears to have had, and we're seeing this in the work that Bob and I are doing, really significant longer run impacts on the US innovation system, not just in policy frameworks, but really in how productive it was. Anecdotally, it opened up entire new fields of research. And we have these quotes from people who were involved at the time. The shift in emphasis and even in direction was enormous. Subjects that were of minor importance in peacetime became of controlling importance in war. Some subjects were even born of war. I'll take us back to the US pharmaceutical industry and the roots that it really has in World War II, and maybe perhaps close with a story of Pfizer. Let me get to that in just a second. And sorry, I know I want to be mindful of time and leave time for questions too. There were lasting effects here on the direction of US innovation, the growth of technology hubs around the country. I think we're expecting similar effects to have taken place in World War II in biomedical research, and we then conjecture that will be the case with post-COVID era too. A deepening of R&D capabilities in firms and universities is involved in this effort. And then, as I mentioned, the foundations for peacetime S&T policy. So let me close with a story that I think will, as I mentioned, close the loop. It's a story of Pfizer. Pfizer, before World War II, was a chemical company. It was a chemical manufacturer founded in around 1850 in New York City by two cousins. And prior to the war, had no particular expertise in drug development, but it did have expertise in fermentation, having developed a method to ferment citric acid. In World War II, the military recognized the value of penicillin because more soldiers died from infectious disease than from actual battlefield wounds. And so an antibacterial agent like that carries a lot of value for the war effort. And that presented a problem of how to scale up production of penicillin, which is one that Pfizer was recruited into because it had expertise in fermenting, which is the method that was thought would be effective at producing the Penicillium notatum mold at scale that's what grows penicillin. And it was through that experience that Pfizer deepened its capabilities in drug development, ultimately after the war pivoted into being a pharmaceutical company, and went from applying for 2 or 3 patents a year to 40 or 50 in the 1950s. Just a total transformation of the company and more broadly the industry. And so coming full circle, Pfizer again is the company, one of the companies that came to save us from the global pandemic. And it in principle would not have been in a position to do so if it weren't for those capabilities it developed 80 years ago in World War II that turned it into a pharmaceutical company. So we'll see what lessons that has and what changes we see coming out of the pandemic going forward. But I think that helps anchor a lot of the what we can learn from this historical experience. At this point, I think let's turn it over to you all and see what we'll talk about.
Thanks so much, Dan, for this excellent and again really concise presentation of your really interesting paper together with Bev and Sampat. We've had a lot of questions coming in on the chat, and Joe, maybe you've had a chance to take a look. Dan, perhaps not yet. Let me put on the table a couple of themes that at least more than one of our participants have raised, and that's around this question of a security focus. And I think I'm going to start actually, Joe, first with you. To what extent do you think it's necessary for this kind of R&D to have a security focus? We have a colleague from Europe, Marcin Rodzinko, who mentions that indeed Europe is thinking about creating a sister agency to BARDA called HERA, this he comments that this agency is supposed to have a Europe first focus. I think you both highlighted, Dan, you highlighted that for COVID-19 we had an America first focus. So to what extent do these efforts need to be framed as security threats, and to what extent is it possible to look at this beyond the interests of any one single country and to try to build global access into any of these efforts? That's in some ways the big picture question. So I'm gonna throw that to both of you. Joe, why don't you dive in first?
So I would say there's a few different schools of thought on that. I had always been a proponent of broadening the aperture of what BARDA worked on based upon the initial track record of success for bioterrorism agents. And part of that was a more robust foray into antibiotic development for the threat of antimicrobial resistance. And then when we started responding to all these emerging infectious disease, whether it was SARS, MERS, Zika, it was clear that we should be moving into that domain and applying the BARDA model, right, to emerging infectious diseases. And then beyond that, I mean, I could see a world where, given if we had success in those areas, we could start moving into neglected tropical diseases, tuberculosis, all sorts of those things. To be honest, we got quite a bit of political headwind on that notion. There was some people, particularly people on Capitol Hill, who were involved in the creation of BARDA, who felt that we should have a singular focus on these national security threats and not deviate, not dilute your mission. And I appreciate that perspective. It makes sense, but I think history now has told us that if we would have set in motion some of these plans to try to build out an emerging infectious disease program, COVID would have still happened. But could we have gotten that vaccine in 6 months or instead of a year? Sure. And how much would that mean to a global GDP, or the United States GDP? So, so I'm hopeful in the future that, given the fact that even since 2001, there really hasn't been any sort of significant terrorism or CBRN incident in the United States, and that the real things that keep cropping up are these natural emerging infectious disease, that there's the foresight, to really kind of have the political will to put these preparedness plans or preparedness infrastructure in place.
Thanks very much. So this could be perhaps one of the follow-on effects of COVID. Let's see. Dan, any of your thoughts on the security framing or the ability to think beyond any one single country's interest?
Right. There are two things that I think about here that at least the history to me provides lessons for. One is I would take us back to the value of that stock of existing basic knowledge around the some of the inputs to these technology development efforts, whether it's World War II technology or medical technology and drug development. And so broadening that base investment, this points to the value of that when a crisis arises, which is typically unpredictable. The second thing I would point out is that looking back, now it surprises me, and perhaps as an opportunity, that we don't exactly have a crisis innovation agency in place that kind of stands at the ready take over these problems and run air traffic control, as I said, when crises arrive. You know, we leaned on warp speed, which in turn invoked BARDA's and BARDA's funding mechanisms and model to meet this moment. But as a result, partly as a result of that, it didn't have that broad aperture that perhaps addressed even some of the social science questions that presented themselves during the pandemic. And having an OSRD-like agency, at least written into the structure of the government, could in principle be a valuable addition to the set of institutions we have to handle problems like these.
Okay, thanks very much. We have a question, a specific one. I think this is probably for you, Joe, that came from Edward Hammond regarding transparency of pricing. Prices agreed by BARDA, and Ed comments that he's not been able to get information on average prices, for example, per dose. And what effect do you think that might have on the willingness of sellers to sell at more affordable prices, for example, in other countries, such as in lower middle income countries?
Yeah, that's it's a challenging question. Typically, I think those contracts should be subject to the Freedom of Information Act. The pricing schemes of other COVID medical countermeasures I've seen have been made public. When we do sit down to negotiate with a company over price, we previously did, we tended to look at comparative medicines, comparators that exist. So if we were procuring a smallpox antiviral, we would look at what is the average cost of other existing antivirals. But then you have to factor in, an HIV medicine that you take every single day for the rest of your life is different than a smallpox antiviral you take for 14 or 21 days and then it's cured. So is there a value to having a curative medicine versus, also we factor in, did they receive NIH support? Did they receive a previous BARDA support? And that kind of factors into our negotiating position. In terms of finding information, again, I think you could FOIA it, and I think I don't know how long that takes, but it is a lengthy process. In terms of low and middle income countries, that's a challenge, and I think I don't have any great answer for it, other than maybe BARDA could be thinking about trying to push companies to try to expand access of the products to the areas where these diseases in some cases are endemic.
Thanks very much. Indeed, a huge topic we could spend a lot more time on, but let me turn to a question that Adriana Lanza-Ruiz from the Graduate Institute has raised regarding whether there were other types of supportive actions, not just funding, but, and this is a question I think for either of you, Jordan, are there other types of support that government agencies offer to support the innovation process, for example, regulatory support? And this is something that we have sometimes referred to as the orchestra conductor or the matchmaker, where it's not just push and pull, which I think has been heavily emphasized in both of your presentations, but something that in some ways softer perhaps. But let me actually turn down first to you and see if Joe, you want to come in on this question after.
I can definitely speak to that. There were certainly examples of that during the war. For example, coordinating technical information exchange among companies working on similar problems. Let's take the synthetic rubber development program. Along with this was a bit of relaxation of antitrust enforcement, allowing companies to exchange proprietary information and ultimately, coordinate on, let's say, a preferred approach and a preferred formula in this case to synthetic rubber. This is the case in other technology areas too, but that's a version that isn't push or pull, but really a coordinating mechanism.
Joe?
I just would add from my previous experience at BARDA that we actually partner pretty closely with the companies that we support, and we don't just give them money and walk away, or we didn't just give them money and walk away. There's a series of subject matter experts within BARDA that are experts in clinical development, experts in manufacturing, experts in regulatory, experts in non-clinical specifically, because a lot of these products are approved under what's called the FDA's animal rule, because you can't do human experiments in some of these instances to prove efficacy. And given that some of these folks actually were some of the first involved in some of the first animal rule approvals, a lot of companies find the input of those folks into and advising them on their program to be very, very helpful in advancing their product. Further, BARDA previously has supported manufacturing capacity that medical countermeasures developers could tap into through its Centers for Innovation, Advanced Development, and Manufacturing. I think post-COVID, those will probably likely get rethought of how those work, and particularly with some of the setbacks that some of those companies had during the response. But they also have ability to do clinical trials. They also have the ability to run other non-clinical studies. So there's really a suite of different things that can be offered and can be done that are non-financially based that can really help accelerate medical countermeasure development.
I think this segues nicely into the question that I wanted to pose to Dan as a follow-on, which is you flagged that there was perhaps more coordination for vaccines in COVID, but for therapeutics, we didn't really seem to see much of that. But in contrast, WHO and in the UK, I think there were efforts to try to have more coordinated efforts for therapeutic R&D to prevent too many people doing the same trial over and over again to try to facilitate information sharing, et cetera. Why do you think it was that in the US there was, it seems to be from your analysis, more of a hands-off approach to COVID therapeutics?
Yeah, and I would say not just therapeutics, but even more so, and even worsely so, all the other problems that are not necessarily ones that medical countermeasures can resolve. There really was a hands-off delegated approach to this. I think this partly has to do with the administration that was, this is of course my perspective, that was in the executive at the time, and their approach to these problems a little bit in my view of not taking full responsibility for the full range of problems that needed to be addressed. But maybe that's being a bit too critical. At the same time, I want to be a bit careful. It partly has to do with differences in, I think also differences in political philosophy. But at the end of the day, in my view, the results, the impact of that World War II coordinated approach do speak for themselves, and I think there were big missed opportunities that proved costly as a result. That's how I think about it. Of course, Joe may have different views, or others out there may too.
Thanks very much. I think we've covered most of the themes, perhaps not all of the specific questions, but most of the themes that have come up in the Q&A. There's one that we have not yet addressed, so I'm going to ask you in our last 2 minutes to comment on that, which is on the sharing of knowledge and intellectual property beyond an individual firm or country. Is that feasible for this kind of R&D? What would be needed to make it happen? We have Andreas Wolf, for example, who commented that WHO played an important role for that. With respect to penicillin back in after World War II. So let me turn first to Dan and then to Joe for last reflections on knowledge, information, and IP sharing before we close.
Right. There's been a lot of concern. Really a lot of, let's say, interest from the public in the U.S. and especially from different corners to try to make vaccine patents, for example, publicly available in the public domain. And I think a lot of that discussion overlooks the fact that technology transfer, a lot of tacit know-how is actually crucial to be able to develop vaccines at scale. And so without that complementary know-how, the patents alone won't actually be able to deliver much value in terms of broader access. And the other risk that I would bear in mind here, and I do think about this in terms of the consistency of policy, is that if patents, if government exercises margin rights on existing patents or abrogates in some way that intellectual property, that could discourage future private sector participation in crisis response. And so I'd want to be careful about that as well. I know the private partners were essential both then and now to the crisis research effort. And they're sensitive to intellectual property rights and how they're allocated. We don't want to turn them away from being partners in the enterprise. And that should be a serious consideration to go with the discussion too.
Joe, your comment?
completely agree with Daniel's perspective. I mean, I used to have discussions with CEOs about margin rights, and I called it, talking them off the ledge, discussions, because they would just, the IP for some of these companies is just, it's critical. And and I also would say, we've also lived the experience where we've had kind of the start and stop of a pandemic. Zika is a great example where there was this crisis. We threw hundreds of millions of dollars. We got vaccine companies involved. They were developing them, and then the cases just kind of stopped, and there was no ability to continue to develop it. And so there was a huge opportunity cost there. So I think Daniel's point about participation in the enterprise should be our #1 priority. I understand that the scale of this event requires probably some degree of ensuring available access globally. I agree with that. I just think we need to proceed carefully and ensure that we don't disincentivize industry from participating in this type of work in the future.
Thanks to you both. In some ways, I opened up a big can of worms right at the end of our time. Obviously, we could keep debating this for a long time, but certainly we've not yet figured out indeed how to ensure that knowledge and technology can be widely shared, despite the historical proportions of this crisis. So with that, let me thank both of our speakers. Let me thank all of our participants, really excellent comments and questions and resources in the chat. Let me thank Marcela Vieira again, who is hiding and has not yet shown her face on screen, but who really has animated and made possible, there she is, this series. Since 2018. And please do take a few moments to respond to our survey now, and the one that many of you, all of you, will receive in January to help us think how we can best take this series forward. So with that, happy holidays to those of you who celebrate, and thank you again. Signing off from Geneva.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.